Welcome, dear travelers, to Mystic Sleep Tales, your sanctuary for stories that drift between the known and the unknown, the remembered and the forgotten. Tonight, as you settle into the comfort of your bed, allow yourself to be transported to a different time, a different place, where the boundaries of reality become as thin as morning mist over the Seine. We specialize in tales of the mystical, the unexplained, the events that history tried to forget but memory refuses to release. From the haunted castles of Scotland to the cursed temples of Cambodia, from vanished ships in the Bermuda Triangle to phantom cities that appear in the desert, we journey together through the mysteries that make our world so beautifully, terrifyingly strange. These are not mere stories, but documented encounters, eyewitness accounts, and legends that have persisted for centuries because somewhere, somehow, they touched something true. Tonight's tale takes us to Paris at the end of the 19th century, to a city of gaslight and shadows, where beneath the grandeur of the Belle Époque, something ancient and inexplicable was stirring. This is the story of a train that should never have existed, a station that appears only to certain travelers, and a journey that defies not just geography, but time itself. So close your eyes, breathe deeply, and prepare to board the last train to Paris, departing from a platform that exists nowhere on any map. Part 1. The Arrival, December 23rd, 1899. The snow fell softly on Paris that December evening, each flake catching the amber glow of the new electric street lamps that were slowly replacing the old gas lights throughout the city. It was 2 days before Christmas, and the streets teemed with last-minute shoppers, their arms laden with packages wrapped in brown paper and string. Horse-drawn carriages clattered over the cobblestones, their bells jingling in harmony with the laughter spilling from cafe doorways. The air smelled of roasting chestnuts, fresh bread, and the sharp, clean scent of winter. But Thomas Ashford noticed none of this. The young British archaeologist walked with his collar turned up against the cold, his leather travel bag heavy against his side, his mind still churning through the implications of what he'd discovered in the Bibliothèque Nationale earlier that day. He'd come to Paris 3 weeks ago following a lead on a series of medieval manuscripts that supposedly described a network of tunnels beneath the city, tunnels that predated even Roman Lutetia, tunnels that the ancient Gauls had used for purposes no scholar could definitively explain. What he'd found was far stranger than he'd imagined. The manuscript spoke not of tunnels, but of passages, of doorways that opened between times, of travelers who stepped into the earth in one century and emerged in another. Most historians dismissed such texts as allegorical, as religious metaphor, or the fevered imaginings of monks driven mad by isolation and fasting. But Thomas had learned, in his years of digging through ruins across Europe and the Near East, that the line between myth and history was often thinner than orthodox scholarship admitted. And now he had an appointment he couldn't miss, though he wasn't entirely certain how the appointment had been made. 3 days ago, he'd returned to his lodgings near the Sorbonne to find a letter waiting for him. There was no return address, no signature, just a message written in an elegant, old-fashioned hand that seemed to belong to another century entirely. The letter was brief. Monsieur Ashford, your research has not gone unnoticed. If you wish to understand the true nature of what lies beneath Paris, come to the Gare de l'Est on December 23rd at precisely 11:47 p.m. Look for platform 13. Come alone. The train waits for no one. You should have dismissed it as a hoax, as someone's idea of a macabre joke. But something about the letter compelled him. Perhaps it was the way the ink seemed to shimmer in certain lights, almost as if it were written in something other than ordinary ink. Perhaps it was the faint smell of smoke and coal that clung to the paper, though his lodgings were nowhere near a railway. Or perhaps it was simply the archaeologist's curse, the inability to resist a mystery. Now, as he approached the Gare de l'Est, Thomas pulled his pocket watch from his waistcoat. 11:32 p.m. 15 minutes until the appointed time. The station loomed before him, its grand Second Empire facade lit dramatically by arc lights. Built just 30 years earlier, it was one of the great monuments to the age of steam and progress, its iron and glass architecture declaring humanity's triumph over distance and time. How ironic, Thomas thought, if what the manuscript suggested was true. The main entrance was closed at this hour, the great doors locked and shuttered. But as Thomas circled the building, he found a side entrance, a small door marked "Personnel Only," standing slightly ajar. This was odd in itself. The French railway companies were notoriously strict about security, especially after a series of accidents and one particularly nasty incident involving an anarchist bomb just 2 years prior. He hesitated, his hand on the cold iron handle. This was his last chance to turn back, to return to his lodgings, to dismiss the entire affair as some elaborate prank or worse, a trap. But the mysteries called to him as they always had, and Thomas Ashford had never been good at resisting that call. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The contrast was immediate and disorienting. Outside had been the modern world, electric lights and bustling streets, the sound of motor cars mixing with horse hooves, the 19th century giving way to the 20th. Inside was something else entirely. The corridor was lit not by electric bulbs, but by flickering gas lamps that cast dancing shadows on walls that seemed older than they should be, stones that bore the patina of centuries rather than decades. The air smelled different too, heavy with coal smoke and something else, something Thomas couldn't quite identify. It was the smell of time itself, of ages layered one upon another, of history compressed into a single moment. He walked forward, his footsteps echoing strangely in the empty corridor. The sounds from outside had vanished completely, as if he'd stepped through some invisible barrier that separated him from the world he knew. The only sound was his own breathing and the distant rumble of what might have been thunder or might have been something else entirely. The corridor opened onto a vast concourse, but it was not the concourse Thomas knew from his previous visits to the Gare de l'Est. This space was older, darker, lit by those same guttering gas lamps that seemed to burn with an unnatural blue-white flame. The floor was paved with stones that looked medieval, inscribed with symbols Thomas recognized from his studies, protective wards from Celtic and Roman traditions, markings meant to keep something in, or perhaps to keep something out. The ticket windows were closed and shuttered, the benches empty, the great departure board silent and still. Thomas might have thought the station simply closed for the night, except for one crucial detail. His watch now read 11:46 p.m., and yet the large clock on the wall, one of those magnificent timepieces that dominated every major station in Paris, read 11:13 p.m. He checked his watch again. Still 11:46. The station clock remained stubbornly fixed at 11:13. Time, it seemed, was not behaving as it should. "Monsieur Ashford, I presume?" Thomas spun around, his heart hammering. He'd heard no approaching footsteps, no warning of another's presence. Yet standing before him was a woman dressed in a style that seemed to belong to the First Empire, perhaps 80 or 90 years out of date. Her gown was a deep midnight blue, elegant in its simplicity, and her dark hair was arranged in a style Thomas had only seen in portraits from the Napoleonic era. But it was her eyes that caught him, held him. They were ancient eyes that had seen far too much, eyes that carried the weight of centuries. "I." "Yes, Thomas managed, his voice sounding strange in the cavernous space. "You were expecting me?" The woman smiled, but it was a sad smile, tinged with something that might have been regret or perhaps simply weariness beyond measure. "We have been expecting you, Monsieur Ashford, for quite some time. Though time, as you may have noticed, does not always behave as expected in this place." "Who are you?" Thomas asked, then immediately felt foolish. Of all the questions he might have asked, that seemed the least important. "My name is Celeste, though names matter little here. What matters is that you received the summons, and you came. That takes a certain kind of courage, or perhaps a certain kind of foolishness. The two are often indistinguishable." She gestured toward the far end of the concourse, where Thomas now noticed a stairway leading down, a stairway he was certain hadn't been there a moment before. "Platform 13 awaits, monsieur. Your train will arrive in precisely 1 minute." Platform 13. Thomas pulled the small station map he'd purchased on his first visit to the Gare de l'Est from his pocket. According to the official map, there were only 12 platforms. "But there is no platform 13. "There is, and there isn't," Celeste replied, her smile never wavering. "It depends on when you're looking, and more importantly, who is doing the looking. Not everyone can see it, you understand. Not everyone can board the train. Only those who carry a certain gift, or perhaps a certain curse. Only those whose minds can accept what their eyes show them." Before Thomas could respond, a sound rose from somewhere deep beneath the station, a sound that started as a distant whisper and grew rapidly into a roar. It was the unmistakable sound of a steam locomotive, but there was something wrong about it, something that made the hair on the back of Thomas's neck stand up. The pitch was wrong, the rhythm off, as if the engine were running on principles that defied the laws of thermodynamics. "You must hurry, monsieur," Celeste said, her voice suddenly urgent. "The train waits for no one, and if you miss this departure, you may wait a very long time for another chance. Years, perhaps. Decades. The schedule is not what one would call regular." Thomas found himself moving toward the stairway, without consciously deciding to do so, drawn by the sound of that impossible engine, by the promise of answers to questions he'd been asking his entire professional life. The stairs descended far deeper than they should have, down through layers of history that Thomas could almost see etched in the walls. There, a Roman inscription. There, medieval stonework. There, something even older, massive blocks fitted together with a precision that spoke of knowledge long lost. And then he was standing on a platform that should not exist. Platform 13 was vast, far larger than any of the upper platforms, its vaulted ceiling lost in shadows that no amount of gaslight could penetrate. The platform was crowded, which surprised Thomas even more than the platform's existence. At least 30 or 40 people stood waiting, but as his eyes adjusted to the dim light, he realized that something was very wrong about these travelers. Their clothing spanned centuries. A man in Renaissance doublet stood next to a woman in a dress from the Ancien Regime. A child in Victorian attire held the hand of what appeared to be a Roman soldier, his armor dulled with age but unmistakable. Near the platform's edge, a group of medieval peasants conversed in what sounded like Old French with a pair of individuals dressed in clothing Thomas couldn't place at all, garments that seemed to belong to no era he recognized. And none of them cast shadows. Thomas's hand tightened on his bag. This was impossible, all of it, and yet here it was happening, real in a way that transcended mere rationality. He thought of the manuscripts, of their warnings about passages between times, and suddenly those words seemed less like metaphor and more like instruction manual. The sound of the approaching train grew louder, and now Thomas could feel it in his bones, a vibration that seemed to resonate not just through the platform, but through time itself. The gaslight flickered, then blazed brighter, and with a thunderous rush of steam and sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, the train arrived. But it was like no train Thomas had ever seen. The locomotive was black, so absolutely black that it seemed to absorb light rather than merely reflect it. Its design was strange, incorporating elements from different eras of railway development, as if someone had taken the best features from a century of engineering and melded them into a single, impossible machine. Steam poured from its stack, but the steam itself was wrong, shimmering with colors that had no names, swirling in patterns that hurt the eyes if looked at too directly. Behind the locomotive stretched a series of carriages, each one different from the others. The first appeared to be from the earliest days of rail travel, a simple wooden box on wheels. The second was more elaborate, a luxurious carriage from the golden age of steam. The third, fourth, and fifth seemed to shift and change even as Thomas watched, their exteriors flickering between different designs as if unable to settle on a single form. Doors along the platform side of the train opened simultaneously, and the waiting passengers began to board. They moved with a strange purposefulness, not hurrying but not hesitating either, as if they'd done this many times before. As they stepped through the doors, Thomas noticed something else that sent a chill through him. The moment a passenger crossed the threshold into the train, they gained substance, became solid and shadow-casting in a way they hadn't been on the platform. The train was making them real. Or perhaps, Thomas thought, it was making them real again. "Monsieur Ashford," a voice called from the nearest carriage door. A tall figure stood silhouetted against the light from within, a figure in a conductor's uniform that seemed to be woven from shadows themselves. "Your ticket, please." Thomas approached slowly, his mind racing. "I don't have a ticket. I received only a letter, a summons." The conductor stepped forward into the gaslight, and Thomas had to suppress a gasp. The man's face was ageless in a way that went beyond mere youth or health. It was as if time had given up trying to mark him, had simply flowed around him like water around a stone. His eyes were the same ancient eyes Thomas had seen in Celeste, eyes that had witnessed the rise and fall of empires. "The summons is your ticket," the conductor said, his voice carrying harmonics that made Thomas's teeth ache. "You are called because you are needed, because the pattern requires you, because there is knowledge you must gain, and perhaps knowledge you must carry. Do you board willingly, Monsieur Ashford? This is not a journey to be undertaken lightly." Thomas thought of his life, his careful academic career, his excavations and publications, and the respect of his peers. He thought of the comfortable future that awaited him, teaching at some prestigious university, perhaps making his name with a significant find, growing old surrounded by books and artifacts and the dusty certainty of established knowledge. And then he thought of the mysteries that had always called to him, the questions no one could answer, the gaps in history that orthodox scholarship simply ignored because they couldn't be explained. He thought of the manuscripts and their promises of impossible things, of doorways between times, of secrets hidden beneath the skin of the everyday world. He had always known, deep down, that if the choice ever came, there was only one decision he could make. "I board willingly," he said. The conductor's severe expression softened, just for a moment, into something that might have been approval or might have been pity. "Then welcome aboard, monsieur. I am Conductor Thevenin, and I have been shepherding passengers on this line for—" He paused, seeming to calculate. "Well, for longer than the calendar has numbers to count. Take any seat you like. The train departs in 30 seconds precisely." Thomas climbed the steps into the carriage, and as he crossed the threshold, he felt it, a sensation like stepping through a waterfall, a momentary resistance, and then a rush of something he had no words for. And then he was inside, standing in a corridor that seemed to stretch into infinity, doors lining both sides as far as he could see. Behind him, he heard the conductor's whistle, a sound that carried notes no earthly whistle could produce. The doors closed with a solid thunk of well-made machinery. The train lurched forward, and Thomas grabbed the nearest handrail to steady himself. Through the window, he watched Platform 13 begin to recede, watched Celeste standing at its edge, raising one hand in farewell or perhaps in warning. The gaslight flickered and dimmed, and then the platform was gone, swallowed by darkness. The train was moving now, building speed, and through the window Thomas saw not the tunnels beneath Paris that he'd expected, but something else entirely. Stars wheeled in impossible configurations. Light bent in ways that defied physics. Time itself seemed to flow backward and forward simultaneously, and Thomas had the dizzying sensation of watching centuries compress into seconds, then expand again into eternities. He was on the last train to Paris, departing from a station that existed nowhere on any map, bound for destinations unknown. And somewhere in the darkness ahead, answers waited. Answers to questions humanity had been asking since the first primitive mind looked up at the stars and wondered if there was more to existence than the simple cycle of day and night, birth and death, beginning and end. Thomas Ashford took a deep breath, adjusted his grip on his bag, and walked forward into the carriage to find a seat. His journey had begun, though to where, and more importantly when, remained to be seen. The train rushed through tunnels of time and space, and ahead, in the strange compartments of this impossible vehicle, waited the other passengers, each with their own story, each with their own reasons for being here, each a piece of a puzzle Thomas was only beginning to understand. The night outside the windows was not the night of any December 23rd that had ever been or would ever be. It was the night between nights, the space between moments, the eternal now that underlies the apparent flow of time. And through this night, the last train to Paris carried its cargo of souls, bound together by fate or chance or something beyond either, traveling toward a destiny that would reshape their understanding of everything they thought they knew about the world and their place in it. But that story would unfold in its own time. For now, Thomas had only one task: to find a seat, to meet his fellow travelers, and to prepare himself for revelations that would challenge everything his education and experience had taught him to believe. The train rushed on through the darkness, its whistle crying out in the void, and the journey truly began. Part 2. The station that shouldn't exist. Thomas made his way down the corridor, his footsteps somehow producing no sound on the richly carpeted floor. The corridor itself was a study in impossible architecture. It was narrow enough that he could touch both walls if he extended his arms, yet when he glanced back, it seemed to stretch infinitely behind him. The ceiling was covered in murals that appeared to shift and change when viewed peripherally, depicting scenes from different eras. Roman legions marching, medieval knights jousting, Renaissance artists painting, Victorian workers building railways. The murals were unsettling in their detail and their movement. As Thomas watched, a painted horse in one scene actually tossed its head, its mane flowing in an impossible breeze. In another panel, a woman in 18th century dress turned to look directly at him, her eyes following him as he passed. He quickened his pace. Doors lined both sides of the corridor, each one bearing a brass plate with a number, but the numbering made no sense. After door 7 came door 23, then door 4, then door 102. It was as if the train's interior existed according to rules that had nothing to do with Euclidean geometry or sequential logic. Thomas chose a door at random, Number 13, because of course he did. The number had brought him here. Perhaps it would guide him now. He turned the handle and stepped inside. The compartment was far larger than it should have been. From the outside, the carriage had appeared to be perhaps 40 feet long, yet this single compartment seemed to encompass at least that much space by itself. It was arranged like a luxurious sitting room rather than a train compartment, with velvet-covered furniture arranged around low tables, bookcases lining the walls, and a fireplace, an actual working fireplace, in one corner where flames danced merrily despite the impossibility of such a thing on a moving train. 3 people occupied the compartment, and as Thomas entered, they all turned to regard him with varying degrees of interest. The first was an elderly man, perhaps in his 70s, with a magnificent white beard and sharp, intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. He wore a well-tailored suit of the current style, and he held a leather-bound journal in which he'd been writing. As Thomas entered, he set down his pen and smiled. "Ah, a new passenger," the man said in French with a Parisian accent. "Welcome, monsieur. I am Dr. Maurice Laurent, formerly of the Sorbonne. Please join us." We were just discussing the nature of temporal causality, though I confess the discussion has become somewhat circular. The second occupant was a woman in her 30s, dressed in a practical traveling suit that suggested the 1880s rather than the current fashion. Her dark hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her expression was one of intense focus as she studied what appeared to be an ancient map spread across the table before her. When she looked up, her eyes were the color of amber, striking in their intensity. "Dr. Marguerite Rousseau," she introduced herself, her French carrying a provincial accent Thomas couldn't quite place. "Historian, or I was before I boarded this train. Now I'm not certain what I am. A scholar of things that should not be, a chronicler of impossibilities." She gestured to an empty chair. "Please sit. You look as though you've seen a ghost, which is ironic given our current circumstances." The third person in the compartment made Thomas do a double-take. It was a young man, perhaps in his early 20s, dressed in the uniform of a Napoleonic soldier. Unlike the ghostly passengers Thomas had seen on Platform 13, this young man appeared entirely solid, entirely real, yet his uniform was authentic, not a costume, and it bore the marks of actual combat, including what appeared to be dried bloodstains on the sleeve. "Lieutenant Henri Beaumont," the young man said, standing and offering a slight bow. "Though I suppose my rank means little now. I fell at Waterloo in 1815, or at least I believe I did. My memories of that day are confused. When I woke, I was on a platform much like the one you just departed from, and a woman told me a train would come. That was..." He frowned, calculating. "I'm not certain how long ago. Time moves strangely here." Thomas lowered himself into the offered chair, his mind reeling. A soldier from Waterloo, a battle that had been fought 84 years ago. And yet this man looked no older than his early 20s, his uniform still bearing the stains of that long-ago conflict. Thomas Ashford, he managed his mouth dry. British archaeologist. "I received a summons 3 days ago. I don't know what I thought." Dr. Laurent chuckled, a warm sound that eased some of Thomas's tension. "One never knows what to think when first boarding this train, Monsieur Ashford. I have been writing for, well, I believe it has been 3 months by the calendar of the outside world, though inside this train, it might be 3 years or 3 minutes. Time, as you will learn, is our most unreliable companion on this journey." Rousseau said, looking up from her map. "Questions we have all asked, and to which we have received only fragmentary answers. The train is called Le Dernier Train, the last train, though to where it is last, or from what it departs last, is never made clear. As for where we are going, that depends." "Depends on what?" "On you," Lieutenant Beaumont said quietly. on all of us. The train takes us where we need to go, or perhaps where we need to be taken. It is not a simple matter of geography, you understand. This train does not travel through space as ordinary trains do. It travels through time, Thomas said, the words sounding absurd even as he spoke them, yet knowing they were true. Through time, yes, Dr. Laurent confirmed, but also through memory, through possibility, through the spaces between moments where reality is thin and other things can shine through. The tunnels we travel are not carved through rock, but through the substance of history itself. Thomas felt a headache beginning to form behind his eyes. He'd spent his professional life studying the past, trying to understand how people had lived and thought and built their civilizations. But this was the past made present, history as a living, breathing thing rather than dusty artifacts and crumbling manuscripts. I was researching manuscripts, Thomas said slowly, trying to organize his thoughts. Medieval texts that spoke of passages beneath Paris, doorways between times. I thought they were allegorical, but they were literal, Dr. Rousseau finished. Yes, Monsieur Ashford, you are not the first to stumble onto these truths, though you may be among the fortunate few to experience them directly. The manuscripts you found were likely written by other travelers, other passengers on this or similar trains. Try to leave records of what they had learned. Tell me, did your research mention the Gare Ames? The term meant station of souls, and Thomas shook his head. No, nothing by that name. Though there were references to a station beneath the earth where the dead and the living mingled, where time folded in on itself. I thought it was religious symbolism, a metaphor for purgatory or the afterlife. It may be those things, Dr. Laurent said, refilling his teacup from a pot that somehow remained hot despite having sat on the table throughout their conversation. But it is also a place, or perhaps a state of being. Platform 13 is one entrance to the Gare de Ames, but there are others scattered throughout Paris, throughout France, throughout the world. They appear and disappear according to rules we do not fully understand. Sometimes a station manifests for a single night. Sometimes it remains for years. The Petite Cincha, Thomas said suddenly, remembering articles he'd read about the old circular railway line around Paris, a line that had been built decades earlier but was already falling into disuse as the new metro system expanded. There are stations along the Petite Cincha that have been abandoned, places where people claim to see and hear things that shouldn't be there. Precisely, Dr. Rousseau said, her eyes lighting up with academic excitement despite the strangeness of the conversation. The Petite Cincha is, in a mundane world, simply an old railway. But it was built along lines of power that existed long before the first rail was laid, along pathways that Celtic druids walked, along Roman roads that followed even older tracks. The Petite Cincha forms a circle, and circles are doorways, Monsieur Ashford. Circles contain and connect. They bind past to present, present to future, and sometimes, as we are experiencing, they allow travel between. Lieutenant Beaumont stood and walked to the window. Thomas followed his gaze and immediately wished he hadn't. Outside was nothing, or rather, it was something so incomprehensible that the human mind wanted to interpret it as nothing. Streams of light and color flowed past the window in patterns that might have been stars, might have been centuries, might have been the dreams of everyone who had ever lived. The first time I looked out the window, the young soldier said softly, I thought I had gone mad. I thought the wound I suffered at Waterloo had killed me after all, and this was some form of afterlife my parish priest had neglected to mention. But Conductor Thevenin explained that we are not dead, not precisely. We are between. between moments, between heartbeats, between the tick and the tock of the universal clock. And we're traveling through this, between place, to arrive where? Thomas asked, though he was beginning to suspect he wouldn't like the answer. That, a new voice said from the doorway, depends entirely on what you're willing to pay. Thomas turned to see conductor Thevenin standing in the doorway, his shadow-woven uniform seeming to absorb the firelight. The conductor stepped into the compartment, and the atmosphere changed immediately, becoming heavier, more serious, as if reality itself pressed more insistently here in his presence. Every passenger on this train is here for a reason, Thevenin said, moving to stand before the fireplace. Dr. Laurent seeks knowledge that was lost when the Library of Alexandria burned. Dr. Rousseau wishes to witness the signing of the Treaty of Verdun that divided Charlemagne's empire. Lieutenant Beaumont. He paused, his ancient eyes softening with something that might have been pity. Lieutenant Beaumont simply wishes to go home, to see his family one more time, to tell them he did not die in pain or fear. The young soldier turned away from the window, and Thomas saw tears glistening on his cheeks. My mother believed I abandoned my post, that I was a coward. The official records listed me as missing, presumed deserted. She died believing her son was a traitor. And this train can take you to these places? Thomas asked. To these times? The train goes where it goes, Thevenin replied. Sometimes it accommodates the desires of passengers. Sometimes it has its own purposes. And always there's a price. Nothing in this world or between worlds comes without cost. What price? Thomas asked, though part of him didn't want to know. That varies, the conductor said. Sometimes it is memory, sometimes a choice, sometimes a sacrifice of something you thought you could never do without. Dr. Laurent has been aboard for 3 months of external time, but inside this train, he has lived and studied for 30 years. That is his prize time. When he steps off this train, he will have the knowledge he seeks, but he will also have aged those 30 years, though to the outside world, only months will have passed. Dr. Laurent nodded calmly, as if this were a reasonable trade. I am old already, Monsieur Ashford. What are a few extra years of aging if I can finally understand the secrets that were lost? I will gladly pay that price. Dr. Rousseau's price, Thevenin continued, is memory. She will witness the event she seeks, but she will not remember her own life before boarding this train. She will become a blank slate, reborn in the moment she sees history made flesh. Dr. Rousseau's smile was sad but determined. I spent my life studying the past, Monsieur Ashford. Perhaps it is time I simply become part of it, without the burden of identity. And Lieutenant Beaumont's price? Thomas asked, dreading the answer. His price is the highest, Thevenin said quietly. He may see his mother, may speak with her, may tell her he was no coward, but only as a ghost. He must relive his death, experience again the moment the cannonball struck him down, feel again the pain and the fear, and then he must watch as his mother grieves, unable to truly comfort her, only to appear as a shade, as a haunting. And when it is done, he will return to this train, and that memory will be all he carries of home. The young soldier's hands clenched into fists at his sides. I have agreed to the price. I will pay it gladly if it means my mother can know the truth. Thomas looked at each of them in turn, these fellow travelers who had made their bargains with the impossible and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature in the compartment. And my price, he asked. What must I pay for whatever knowledge or experience awaits me? Conductor Thevenin studied him for a long moment, those ageless eyes seeming to look not at Thomas but through him, seeing something Thomas himself couldn't perceive. Your price, Monsieur Ashford, has not yet been determined. You're different from most passengers. You were summoned for a specific purpose, called because the pattern of time itself requires your presence. You are not merely a passenger. You are, in some sense, the reason this particular journey is happening at all. I don't understand, Thomas said, his voice barely above a whisper. You will, Thevenin replied. In time, you will understand everything. For now, simply know that this train will take you where you need to go, show you what you need to see, and when the journey is complete, you will face a choice. The nature of that choice I cannot reveal, but the fate of many things hinges upon it. With that cryptic pronouncement, the conductor turned to leave. At the doorway, he paused and looked back. We will arrive at our first stop in 1 hour, station time. I suggest you all prepare yourselves. What you see may challenge your understanding of everything you believe to be true. And then he was gone, the door closing behind him with a soft click that somehow sounded like a cell door locking. Thomas sat back in his chair, his mind spinning. He had wanted adventure, had wanted mysteries and secrets revealed. But now, faced with the reality of what he'd stumbled into, he felt overwhelmed by the weight of it all. It is a lot to take in, is it not? Dr. Laurent said kindly, setting down his journal. I remember my first hour aboard this train. I nearly went mad, trying to reconcile what I was experiencing with what I believed to be possible. But you will adapt, Monsieur Ashford. Humans are remarkably adaptable, even to impossibility. Especially to impossibility, Dr. Rousseau added. After all, every impossible thing eventually becomes possible once someone is brave enough or foolish enough to attempt it. Railways themselves were once considered impossible. Human flight was impossible. Instant communication across vast distances was impossible. And yet, here we are, at the end of the 19th century, living in an age of wonders. Why should temporal travel be any more impossible than any other marvel? Because time is supposed to be absolute, Thomas said, clinging to the scientific principles he'd learned. It flows in one direction, from past to future. We can remember the past, but we cannot change it. We can imagine the future, but we cannot know it. That's the fundamental nature of existence. Is it? Lieutenant Beaumont asked, returning from the window to rejoin them. Or is that simply what we have been taught to believe? Consider, Monsieur Ashford, your own profession. You dig into the earth and pull forth objects from the past. In a sense, you bring the past into the present. Is that so different from what this train does? It's entirely different, Thomas protested. I find artifacts, yes, but I don't interact with the past itself. I don't speak with Caesar or watch the building of the pyramids. Don't you? Dr. Rousseau asked. When you hold a Roman coin in your hand, are you not touching something that a Roman held? When you walk through ruins, are you not walking where the ancients walked? The past is never truly gone, Monsieur Ashford. It is layered beneath the present, and sometimes in certain places, under certain conditions, those layers can be peeled back, and we can step through. The train whistle sounded then, that impossible sound that carried harmonics from no earthly instrument. The compartment seemed to shudder slightly, though whether from physical motion or something else, Thomas couldn't tell. Through the window, the incomprehensible flux of light and color began to resolve into something more concrete. Thomas saw buildings, streets, but they flickered and changed, showing the same location in different eras. There, a Roman villa. There, a medieval fortress. There, a Renaissance mansion. There, a 19th century boulevard. All occupying the same space, all equally real, all visible simultaneously. We're approaching the first station, Dr. Laurent said, standing and straightening his jacket. I suggest we make our way to the doors. The conductor was not exaggerating when he said the train waits for no one. If you're not at a door when we stop, you will not have the option to disembark. Should we disembark? Thomas asked, standing reluctantly. Is it safe? Safe. Dr. Rousseau laughed, though there was no humor in the sound. Monsieur Ashford, nothing about this journey is safe. But it is necessary, at least for those of us who have chosen to take it. Whether you disembark at this first station or wait for another, that is your choice. But I would recommend at least looking, at least seeing what awaits. Knowledge, after all, is what you sought, is it not? Thomas had to admit she was right. He had come seeking answers, seeking to understand the mysteries he'd found in those manuscripts. And here he was, living those mysteries, experiencing them firsthand. To turn back now, to refuse to see what waited at this first impossible station, would be a betrayal of everything he believed in, everything he'd worked for. I'll disembark, he said, surprised by the firmness in his own voice. I'll see what there is to see. Good, Conductor Thevenin said, appearing suddenly in the doorway as if he'd never left, or perhaps as if he'd been there all along and they simply hadn't noticed. Then come, all of you. Our first stop awaits, and the passengers are eager to depart. They followed the conductor into the corridor, joining a stream of other passengers emerging from other compartments. Thomas saw people in clothing from a dozen different eras, speaking a babble of languages, their expressions ranging from eager anticipation to abject terror. This, he realized, was a train full of people like him, people who had touched the impossible and been changed by it, people who had made their bargains and were now living with the consequences. The corridor seemed shorter now, or perhaps time was being compressed again. In what felt like only moments, but might have been hours, they arrived at a door leading to one of the carriages that had appeared to be constantly shifting when Thomas first boarded. Now, however, it had settled into a single form, an ornate carriage that looked like it belonged to the height of French aristocracy, all gilt and velvet and elaborate decoration. The door opened, and Thomas stepped through onto a platform that took his breath away. They were in a station, yes, but it was a station unlike any Thomas had ever seen or imagined. The architecture was impossible, combining elements from different eras and cultures in ways that should have clashed, but somehow harmonized perfectly. Roman arches supported Gothic vaulting. Art Nouveau irowork framed Byzantine mosaic, and the scale was vast, the ceiling soaring hundreds of feet overhead, though Thomas knew they had descended only perhaps 50 feet below the Gare de l'Est. But it was the people that truly astonished him. The platform teemed with hundreds, perhaps thousands, of people, and they represented not just different eras but different states of being. Some appeared as solid as Thomas himself. Others were translucent, ghostly. Still others seemed to flicker between states, now solid, now transparent, as if they couldn't decide whether they were fully present or not. Welcome, Conductor Thevenin said, his voice somehow audible despite the din of conversation echoing through the vast space, to the Gare de Ames, the station of souls. This is the hub, the nexus, the point where all the temporal rails converge. From here, trains depart to every when and everywhere. From here, passengers can board routes to any moment in history, any place in memory, any possibility that was or might have been. Thomas stared in wonder at the departure board, a massive construct of brass and glass that seemed to float in midair. But instead of listing destinations like Lyon or Marseilles, it showed times and events. Rome, 44 BCE, Plateforme 17. London, 1666, Platform 9. Gettysburg, 1863, Platform XXII. Hiroshima, 1945, Plateforme L. And hundreds more, Thousands more dates and places scrolling past faster than Thomas could read. A catalog of every significant moment in human history, and perhaps moments that had never been, possibilities that had been glimpsed but never realized. "This is madness," Thomas whispered. "Yes," Dr. Laurent agreed, standing beside him. "But it is glorious madness, is it not? Everything you have ever studied, every question you have ever asked, the answers are here, Monsieur Ashford. Every mystery can be solved. Every gap in history can be filled. You need only choose your platform, board your train, and go." "But the price," Thomas said, remembering Thevenin's words. "What will I have to pay?" "That," the conductor said, materializing beside them with that unsettling instantaneousness, "you will not know until the moment comes. But know this, Monsieur Ashford, you were not brought here merely to be another passenger. You were brought here because there is a specific destination awaiting you, a specific moment in time that requires your presence. And when you reach that moment, you will understand why. You will understand everything." The conductor handed Thomas a ticket, a piece of parchment covered in symbols that seemed to shift and change as he looked at them. "Platform 13, Thevenin said. "Your train departs in 10 minutes. Do not be late." And before Thomas could ask any of the 100 questions swirling in his mind, the conductor was gone, vanished into the crowd of impossible travelers moving through this station outside of time. "Docteur," Laurent clasped Thomas' shoulder. "Good luck, my friend. Whatever awaits you, face it with courage. The train chose you for a reason. Trust in that, if nothing else." Dr. Rousseau offered a sad smile. "Perhaps we will meet again, Monsieur Ashford, in some other time, some other place. The rails of this network stretch far and wide. Who knows what strange stations we may all pass through." Lieutenant Beaumont simply saluted, a gesture both heartbreaking and dignified, the action of a soldier who had faced death and now faced something potentially worse, the eternal in-between of this twilight world. And then they were gone, each heading to their own platform, their own train, their own destiny. Thomas looked down at the ticket in his hand, at the symbols that now resolved into something he could read. Platform 13, departure time. The moment that was slash is slash will be destination. Paris, April 13th, 1794. The French Revolution. The height of the terror, when the guillotine's blade rose and fell daily, when the streets of Paris ran red with blood, when France tore itself apart in the name of liberty, equality, and fraternity. Why there? Why then? What purpose could his presence serve in that blood-soaked year? There was only one way to find out. Thomas Ashford, British archaeologist, man of science and reason, holder of an impossible ticket to an impossible destination, made his way through the crowd toward platform 13, where another train waited, another journey beckoned, and another chapter in this strangest of adventures was about to begin. The Gare Ames pulsed with life and death and everything in between, a station that existed everywhere and nowhere, every when and never, and Thomas was lost in its impossible vastness, a tiny figure swept along by currents of time and fate he could not hope to understand. But he would try. That was what he did, what he had always done. He would try to understand, try to find meaning in the madness, try to uncover the truth beneath the impossible. The train whistle called, and Thomas quickened his pace. Platform 13 awaited, and with it, the next impossible revelation in a night that had redefined the very meaning of the word impossible. Then you succeeded, Thomas said, confused. You changed the past. Did I? The old monk smiled sadly. I thought so at first. I returned to this station triumphant, certain I had rewritten history, that somewhere in my world those texts now existed, preserved by my intervention. But when I inquired, when I searched, I found no trace of them. The library of St. Denis burned in 1430. The manuscripts were lost. Nothing had changed. He sighed deeply. That is when I began to understand the true nature of this train, of this station, of the journeys we take. We do not travel into the past as it was. We travel into echoes of the past, reflections, possibilities. We can change these echoes, shape them as we will, but the true thread of history, the prime reality, if you will, remains untouched. Our efforts are like writing stories in sand, beautiful in the moment, but washed away by the tide of time. Then it's all futile, Thomas said, a sinking feeling in his chest. Everything these people are doing, trying to save their loved ones, trying to change their failures, it's all for nothing. I did not say it was for nothing, Brother Aldrich replied. I said the past could not be changed, but we could be changed. Each time I return to the monastery, I remember more clearly what was lost, understand more deeply the value of what we had. Each time, I become a better guardian of knowledge, a better keeper of memory. And when my journeys finally end, if they ever do, I will carry that knowledge forward, perhaps to a time when it can make a difference. A deep, resonant gong sounded through the station, echoing from some invisible source. The passengers on platform 13 stirred, straightening their clothes, gathering their meager belongings. The train approaches, Colonel Marchand said, his military bearing reasserting itself. Style yourself, mes amis. Whatever awaits us in the past, in those echoes of time, we must face it with courage. Thomas felt the now familiar vibration building, the sense of something vast and impossible drawing near. The air grew thick, heavy with anticipation. Along the platform, other passengers appeared, figures who had been there all along, but whom Thomas had somehow failed to notice. A woman in ancient Roman garb, a man dressed as a Renaissance courtier, a child who looked no older than 10, wearing clothes from a period Thomas couldn't immediately identify. Each carried the same burden Thomas had seen in all the others, the weight of some tragedy, some failure, some moment in history they desperately wished to change. Each was locked in their own cycle of hope and despair, trying over and over to reshape the past, succeeding only in reshaping themselves. And then the train was there. It emerged from the tunnel not like a normal train, but like a thought becoming solid, like a dream taking form. One moment the tracks were empty. The next they were filled with that great black locomotive and its string of impossible carriages. Steam hissed from valves, though the steam was wrong, shot through with colors that had no names. The carriages themselves seemed to shift and change even as they came to rest at the platform, their exteriors cycling through different styles and eras. The doors opened with a sound like a sigh, and Conductor Thevenin appeared, stepping down to the platform with that same supernatural grace. His ancient eyes swept over the assembled passengers, and Thomas could have sworn he saw something like pity in them. Platform 13 passengers, the conductor intoned, his voice carrying over the hiss of impossible steam. Boarding now for destinations temporal and memorial. Those bound for Paris, April 1794, please proceed to Car 7. Waterloo, June 1815, Car 11. Paris, June 1848, Car 19. St. Denis, October 1430, Car 23. All other destinations, consult your tickets for appropriate carriage assignments. The passengers began to move toward their designated cars, but before Thomas could follow, Thevenin appeared beside him, having traversed the length of the platform in the blink of an eye. "Monsieur Ashford," the conductor said quietly. "A word, if you please." Thomas stepped aside, letting the other passengers board. Madame Mercier paused as she passed, touching his arm gently. "Bonne chance, monsieur. May you find what you seek, and may the price not be too high." When the platform had cleared and they were alone, Thevenin studied Thomas with those timeless eyes. "You are wondering why you are here," the conductor said. It was not a question. "Yes," Thomas said. "All these people, they have reasons, tragedies they're trying to prevent or understand. But I'm just a scholar who found some manuscripts. I haven't lost anyone. I have no failures to correct. So why was I summoned? Because you are not here to change the past, Monsieur Ashford. You are here to understand it. The others, they are trapped in cycles of their own making, trying to reshape history to fit their desires. But you have been chosen for a different purpose entirely, which is to witness," Thevenin said simply, "to observe, to remember. There are moments in history that must be seen, must be understood, not to be changed, but to be preserved. You have been chosen as a witness to one such moment, perhaps the most important moment in the history of Paris, perhaps in the history of France itself." April 1794, Thomas said, looking at his ticket. "What happens then? What am I supposed to witness?" "That you will discover when you arrive. But I will tell you this. What you witness will challenge everything you believe about the nature of time, the fabric of reality, and the role of individual choice in the sweep of history. You will see something that should not be possible, something that suggests history itself is not what we have been taught to believe." Thevenin placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder, and Thomas felt a shock of something electric pass through him. The others can try to change the past because their efforts are ultimately futile, contained within echoes that diverge from the true thread of time. But you, Monsieur Ashford, you will touch the true thread itself. And when you do, you must make a choice that will affect not just your own life, but the lives of everyone connected to the moment you witness. "I don't understand," Thomas said, fear rising in his chest. "What choice? What moment? You will know when the time comes. Now board. Your carriage awaits, and the train departs in 30 seconds. Remember, Monsieur Ashford, you are not here to change history. You are here to preserve it. The distinction is crucial." With that cryptic pronouncement, the conductor turned and glided back to the locomotive, leaving Thomas standing alone on the platform, his mind reeling with questions and fears. 20 seconds. Thomas looked at the train, at Car 7 where his destination awaited, and felt the weight of the ticket in his hand like an anchor pulling him toward a fate he could not predict or avoid. 15 seconds. He thought of his comfortable life, his academic career, his studies of the safe, dead past that could never threaten or challenge him. He could refuse to board. He could turn back, try to find a way out of this station, back to the world he knew. 10 seconds. But he had never been good at turning away from mysteries. And this was the greatest mystery of all, a journey into the heart of history itself. To witness something that should not be possible, to make a choice that would matter in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. 5 seconds. Thomas made his decision, the only decision he could make. He ran. His feet pounded on the platform as he raced toward Car 7. The doors were already beginning to close. He dove through the gap, landing hard on the carriage floor just as the door sealed behind him with a sound like a tomb closing. The train lurched into motion immediately, building speed impossibly fast. Through the windows, Thomas saw the station fall away, saw the impossible architecture blur into streaks of light, saw the solid world dissolve into the flux and flow of the spaces between times. He had boarded the train. He was committed now to whatever destiny awaited him in Paris. In April of 1794, in the height of the terror, in a moment of history that would apparently challenge everything he thought he knew. Thomas picked himself up from the floor, dusted off his coat, and looked around the carriage. It was empty, or appeared to be at first glance. But as his eyes adjusted to the dim light, he saw a single figure sitting in the shadows at the far end. It was a woman, dressed in clothing from the Revolutionary period, her hair unpowdered and pulled back in the style of that era. She did not look up as Thomas approached, but he could see her shoulders shaking, as if she were crying or perhaps laughing. It was impossible to tell which. "Excuse me," Thomas said gently. "Are you also bound for Paris, April 1794? The woman raised her head, and Thomas gasped. Her face was young, perhaps in her late 20s, but her eyes were ancient, far more ancient even than the conductor's. They were eyes that had seen the end of worlds and the beginning of new ones, eyes that carried knowledge so vast and terrible that no human mind should be able to contain it. "Monsieur Ashford," she said, and her voice was like music and like morning, like the first breath of spring and the last sigh of winter. "I have been waiting for you, waiting for such a very long time. Welcome to the journey that will change everything or nothing or something in between. Welcome to the moment when you must choose who lives and who dies, and in doing so, determine the shape of centuries yet to come." "Who are you?" Thomas whispered, though he was not certain he wanted to know the answer. "I am called many names," the woman said, rising from her seat and moving toward him with a grace that was almost inhuman. "Some call me memory. Some call me fate. Some call me the ghost of what might have been. But you may call me Marguerite, if it comforts you to give me a simple human name." She smiled, but it was not a comforting smile. "I am your guide for this journey, Monsieur Ashford. I am the one who will show you what must be seen, who will explain what must be understood, and who will ensure that when the moment comes, you make the right choice. Or at least, you make a choice, for in the end, that is all any of us can do." The train whistled, that impossible sound that carried harmonics from beyond the range of human hearing, and Thomas felt the acceleration increase, felt reality bending around them as they plunged deeper into the tunnels of time. "Sit," Marguerite said, gesturing to a seat beside her. "We have far to travel and much to discuss. The history of France in 1794 is not what you have been taught, Monsieur Ashford. The terror was not simply political violence run amok. It was something far stranger, something that touches on the very nature of how history is made and unmade, remembered and forgotten." Thomas sat, because what else could he do? He was trapped on a train traveling through time itself, guided by a being who claimed to be fate or memory or something equally incomprehensible, bound for a destination in the bloodiest period of French history, with a choice awaiting him that would somehow matter to centuries yet to come. This was madness. All of it was madness. But as Brother Aldrich had said, perhaps the point was not to avoid the madness, but to be changed by it, to learn from it, to carry forward the knowledge gained even if the past itself remained immutable. "Tell me," Thomas said, forcing his voice to remain steady. "Tell me what I need to know." Marguerite smiled again, and this time there was something almost like approval in her ancient eyes. "Very well, Monsieur Ashford. Let me tell you the true story of Paris in the Year of Terror, and let you begin to understand why you, of all people, have been chosen to witness what is to come." And as the train rushed through the darkness between moments, through tunnels carved not through rock, but through the very substance of time itself, Marguerite began to speak, and Thomas began to understand that the history he thought he knew was merely the surface of something far deeper, far stranger, and far more terrifying than any academic treatise had ever suggested. The journey into the heart of history had truly begun. Part 4. Through the Tunnels of Time. The carriage in which Thomas sat defied logic in ways that were becoming almost routine. Though it had appeared small from the outside, the interior seemed to stretch infinitely, not in physical space, but in some other dimension Thomas lacked the vocabulary to describe. The walls were not walls in any conventional sense, but rather surfaces that displayed scenes from history like windows onto the past, or perhaps like memories given form. Marguerite sat across from him, her posture perfectly composed, her ancient eyes fixed on his face with an intensity that made Thomas want to look away, but found he could not. There was something hypnotic about her gaze, something that suggested she could see not just his present self, but all his possible selves, all the choices he had made and might yet make, all the branching paths of his existence spreading out like the roots of an infinite tree. "Before I tell you what awaits in Paris," Marguerite said, her voice carrying that same musical quality, "you must first understand what this train truly is, what these journeys truly mean. The conductor has told you fragments, as have your fellow passengers. But fragments are all they understand. I will show you the whole truth, or as much of it as a human mind can contain without shattering." She gestured toward the walls of the carriage, and the scenes flickering across them began to resolve into clarity. Thomas saw ancient Rome at its height, saw medieval Europe in the grip of plague, saw the Renaissance flowering in Italian cities, saw the French Revolution in all its chaotic glory. "History," Marguerite said, "is not what you have been taught to believe. It is not a simple linear progression from past to present to future. It is not a chain of cause and effect, where each event inevitably produces the next. History is a living thing, Monsieur Ashford, constantly being born and reborn, constantly being shaped and reshaped by forces you cannot see and influences you cannot measure." Thomas wanted to protest, to defend the rational materialist understanding of history his education had instilled. But the words died in his throat as he watched the scenes on the walls. Because they were not showing history as it had been. They were showing history as it might have been, could have been, should have been, but never was. There, he saw a Rome that never fell, its empire spreading to encompass the entire world. There, he saw a Europe where the Black Death killed not a third of the population, but 90%, reducing civilization to scattered pockets of survivors. There, he saw a French Revolution that ended not in terror, but in peaceful reform, with Louis XVI becoming a constitutional monarch and France leading Europe into a new age of enlightenment without the need for guillotines. "These are the echoes," Marguerite explained, following his gaze. "The might-have-beens, the could-have-beens, the infinite branching paths that diverge from what you call the true thread of history. Every choice, every action, every chance occurrence creates a branching, a moment where reality splits into multiple possibilities. Most of these branches are weak, ephemeral, existing for only a moment before collapsing back into the main thread. But some are strong, some persist, creating entire worlds of possibility that run parallel to the history you know. And this train," Thomas said slowly, understanding dawning, "travels not just through time, but between these branches." "Precisely," Marguerite confirmed. "The conductor was correct when he told you that the other passengers cannot truly change the past. They travel into these echo branches, these alternative histories, and there they play out their dramas, trying to save those they lost, trying to correct their mistakes. And sometimes they succeed, within the confines of that particular branch. But the true thread remains untouched, and when they return to this station, they find that nothing has changed in the world they left behind. Then why allow it? Thomas asked. Why offer them hope if it's ultimately false? Because hope is never false, Marguerite said with surprising gentleness. What they do in those echo branches matters, Monsieur Ashford, even if it does not change the prime reality. Every echo enriches the symphony of existence. Every alternative strengthens the overall structure of time. And more importantly, the travelers themselves are changed. They learn, they grow, they understand. And when they finally accept that they cannot change what was, they're able to change what will be, to move forward with wisdom earned through futile struggle. She leaned forward, her eyes boring into his. But you, Monsieur Ashford, you are different. You are not traveling to an echo. You are traveling to a moment on the true thread itself. A moment that is not simply remembered but actively observed, maintained, preserved by forces beyond your comprehension. You're going to witness something that should not exist, something that suggests the true thread itself is not as immutable as we have believed. What am I going to see? Thomas asked, though he was no longer certain he wanted to know. You're going to see a divergence, Marguerite said. A moment when history tried to branch, when the true thread itself attempted to split into two equally valid realities. It is the rarest of phenomena, occurring perhaps once in a millennium. And Paris in April 1794 is such a moment. She stood and moved to the wall, placing her hand against one of the flickering scenes. Immediately, the image stabilized and expanded, filling Thomas's entire field of vision. He was no longer looking at the scene, but within it, as if he had been transported there while remaining somehow in the carriage. He saw Paris, but not the Paris of any time he knew. The streets were crowded with people, but they moved with a strange purposefulness, as if they were actors in a play who knew their lines but were waiting for a cue that never came. The buildings were solid, but somehow translucent, as if they were real and unreal simultaneously. And hanging over everything was a palpable sense of tension, of reality itself held in suspension, waiting for something to tip the balance one way or another. This is the Paris of the divergence, Marguerite explained. On April 13th, 1794, something happened, or was supposed to happen, or try to happen. The historical records are silent on the specifics, as they must be when dealing with moments of such profound uncertainty. But those who study the deep patterns of time, we know. On that day, two versions of Paris existed simultaneously, overlapping, interpenetrating, each trying to become the definitive reality. What was different? Thomas asked, mesmerized by the strange scene before him. In one branch, the terror continues as history records it. Robespierre and the Committee of Public Safety maintain their grip on power. The guillotine continues to claim victims daily. France spirals deeper into paranoia and bloodshed until finally, in July, Robespierre himself is overthrown and executed, and the terror ends. Marguerite gestured, and the scene shifted, showing a different Paris, one that was somehow darker, more menacing. But in the other branch, something different occurred. A single individual, a woman named Helene Dubois, made a choice that altered everything. She was a common woman, a baker's wife, mother of three. She was not educated, not political, not notable in any way history would normally record. But on the night of April 12th, she overheard a conversation between two men planning to assassinate Robespierre. She had a choice, Marguerite continued. She could report what she heard to the authorities, ensuring the plot was foiled and Robespierre remained in power. or she could remain silent, allowing the assassination to proceed. In the true thread of history, she reported it. The plotters were arrested and executed. Robespierre lived, and the terror continued for 3 more months. But in the Echo branch, Thomas asked, though he could guess the answer. In the Echo branch, she remained silent. The assassination succeeded. Robespierre died on April 13th instead of July 28th. The terror ended 3 months early. Thousands of lives were saved. The course of French history shifted. And that branch was strong, Monsieur Ashford, so strong that it nearly became the prime reality. For a brief time, both versions of Paris existed simultaneously, each as real as the other, each trying to collapse the other into non-existence. Thomas felt a chill run through him. And what happened? Obviously, the assassination branch didn't become reality, since history records Robespierre dying in July. No, Marguerite agreed, but it came terrifyingly close. The divergence lasted for 13 hours, from midnight on April 12th to 1 o'clock in the afternoon on April 13th. During that time, Paris existed in a state of quantum uncertainty, if you'll forgive the anachronistic term. Some people experienced one version of events, some the other. Some experienced both simultaneously, their consciousness splitting between the two realities until they went mad from the contradiction. She pulled her hand away from the wall, and the vision faded, leaving them once again in the dim carriage. And then, at 1 o'clock in the afternoon on April 13th, the divergence collapsed. One reality won, one reality lost. The true thread continued, incorporating the Echo branch back into itself. But the memory of what might have been remained, preserved in the deep structures of time, accessible only to those who know how to look or who are foolish enough to board a train like this one. And you want me to witness this moment, Thomas said, to see the divergence as it happened. Not want, Marguerite corrected. Need. You must witness this moment, because you are the only one who can. You see, Monsieur Ashford, every great divergence creates a witness, someone who experiences both branches simultaneously without going mad, someone who can hold both versions of reality in their mind at once and understand what is happening. You have been chosen, or perhaps called, or perhaps simply drawn by the pattern of your own life, to be the witness of the Paris divergence. But why? Thomas asked desperately. Why me? What makes me special? Nothing, Marguerite said bluntly. And everything. You are special because you are ordinary. You have no personal stake in the events of 1794. You have no loved ones to save, no political agenda to advance. You're simply a scholar who wishes to understand. And that purity of purpose, that lack of self-interest, makes you the perfect vessel for what must be done, which is to remember both branches equally, to hold in your mind the Paris that was and the Paris that might have been, and to understand that both are equally true, equally valid, equally real. And then, when you return to your own time, to carry that knowledge forward, to be a living record of the moment when history tried to split and failed. Thomas felt the weight of this responsibility settling on his shoulders like a physical burden. And what if I don't want this? What if I refuse to be your witness? Marguerite's expression softened slightly. Then you will have made a choice, and that choice will have consequences. The divergence still occurred, still exists in the deep structures of time. If you do not witness it, do not preserve both versions in your memory. Then one version will fade, will be lost forever. And with it will be lost the proof that history is not fixed, that reality is not singular, that what we call the past is merely the version that survived, not the only version that existed. Why does that matter? Thomas asked. Because, Marguerite said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. If people knew that history could have been different, that the suffering and tragedy they endured was not inevitable, but was merely one possibility among many, they might begin to question the inevitability of the future. They might begin to believe that they can change what is to come, not by traveling to the past, but by shaping the present. And that belief, Monsieur Ashford, is the most dangerous and most powerful force in existence. The train whistled again, and Thomas felt the speed increasing, felt reality bending more sharply around them. Through the windows, he could see Paris taking shape, but it was a Paris that flickered and shifted, showing two versions overlapping, one where Robespierre lived and one where he died, one where the terror continued, and one where it ended early. "We are arriving," Marguerite said. "The moment approaches. When we stop, you will step onto a platform in Paris on the morning of April 13th, 1794. You will have until 1 o'clock in the afternoon to witness the divergence, to experience both branches, to understand what happened and what might have happened. And then you must make your choice." "What choice?" Thomas asked, though he dreaded the answer. "The choice of which version to remember more strongly," Marguerite said. "Your memory will determine which branch receives more weight in the deep structures of time. You cannot change what happened, Monsieur Ashford. The true thread will remain the true thread. But you can affect how much power the echo retains, how strongly it persists in the collective unconscious of humanity. If you remember the assassination branch more strongly, it will remain a powerful echo, a beacon of hope suggesting that history could have been different. If you remember the true thread more strongly, the echo will fade, and the divergence will be forgotten, becoming merely another might have been that never quite was." The train was slowing now, the flickering Paris outside the window beginning to stabilize into a single, solid reality, or rather two solid realities overlapping. Thomas could see a station platform ahead, but it was doubled, showing two versions of the same space, one where Revolutionary Guards patrolled, and one where the platform was empty save for a woman who appeared to be weeping. "There is no right choice," Marguerite said as the train came to a complete stop. "Both options have merit. Both options have consequences. You will witness what you witness, and then you will remember what you remember, and the weight of that memory will shape the echo's strength. That is all that is required of you. That is all that is possible." The door of the carriage opened, and beyond it, Thomas could see the doubled platform, hear the doubled sounds of the city, smell the doubled sense of Paris in 1794, smoke and bread and blood and fear. "Go," Marguerite said. "Experience the divergence. And when it collapses, when one reality wins and one reality loses, remember that both were real, both mattered, both contained the hopes and fears and choices of real people trying to shape a world they could believe in." Thomas stood on shaking legs and walked toward the door. As he stepped over the threshold, he felt the same sensation he'd experienced boarding the train at the Gare de l'Est, that sense of passing through a waterfall of resistance and then release. And then he was standing on a platform in Paris on April 13th, 1794, and he could see, could feel, could experience two versions of the city simultaneously. In one, soldiers marched through streets stained with blood. In the other, people celebrated in streets washed clean by rain. In one, the terror ground on relentlessly. In the other, hope had been reborn. Both were real. Both were happening. Both demanded his attention, his understanding, his memory. Thomas Ashford, scholar and accidental witness, stepped forward into the doubled Paris, into the heart of the divergence, ready to experience 13 hours that had and had not happened, to witness a moment when history tried to rewrite itself and came terrifyingly close to succeeding. The divergence awaited, and with it, the choice that would determine how strongly an echo of hope persisted in the deep structures of time. The weight of that responsibility would have crushed a weaker man. But Thomas, for all his academic caution, had never been weak. He had simply been waiting for a mystery worthy of his courage. He had found it. The 13 hours began. In the other branch, I said nothing. The assassination succeeded. Robespierre died on April 13th, shot in the street on his way to the committee meeting. The terror ended shortly after, as his death broke the machinery of repression. Lives were saved, hope returned, but the conspirators were connected to our neighborhood. In the chaos that followed, my family's bakery was burned by a mob of Robespierre supporters seeking revenge. My husband was killed in the fire. In that branch, I am a widow, destroyer of my own family. Helene's tears flowed freely now, streaming down both versions of her face. So you see, Monsieur Witness, there is no good choice, no right answer. In one branch, I saved my family but condemned thousands of others. In the other branch, I saved thousands but destroyed my family. And I must live in both, must experience both, must be torn apart by the contradiction until this divergence ends and one reality wins. Thomas felt tears on his own cheeks. "Which do you hope wins?" he asked softly. Helene was silent for a long moment. "I don't know," she finally whispered. "I honestly don't know. Each version of me hopes her branch is the one that survives, that becomes the true reality. But there's a part of me, the part that exists between branches, that hopes both are false, that neither is the true thread, that somewhere there's a third option I never saw, a choice that could have saved everyone." "But there isn't," Thomas said, not unkindly. "Sometimes there are no good choices, only less terrible ones." "I know," Helene said, "and that is the knowledge I will carry if I survive this divergence with my sanity intact. The knowledge that the world is not just, that goodness is not rewarded, that sometimes we must choose between unbearable options and live with the consequences. It is a terrible knowledge, Monsieur Witness. I do not recommend it." The bells tolled 9 o'clock, and Thomas felt the divergence intensify around them. The two versions of the square seemed to pulse, each one trying to assert its reality more forcefully. In the Terror Continues branch, the crowd around the guillotine grew larger, noisier. In the Assassination Succeeds branch, the empty square seemed to glow with a quiet hope that was almost painful to perceive. "I must go," Helene said, rising to her feet, both sets of feet. The moment approaches when the divergence will collapse, when one branch will win and one will lose. I must be ready to accept whichever reality survives, to live with that choice even though I never truly made it, even though it was made for me by forces I cannot understand or control. She looked at Thomas one more time. "Remember me, Monsieur Witness. Remember that I tried to do what was right, even though I could not determine what right was. Remember that ordinary people like me are caught up in the sweep of history, forced to make impossible choices with consequences we can barely comprehend. And when you return to your own time, remember that every date in your history books represents millions of these impossible choices, millions of Helenes torn between terrible options." Then she walked away, moving through both versions of the square simultaneously, a woman split by history, damned by choice, a living embodiment of the tragedy that occurs when a moral calculus offers no good solutions. Thomas watched her go and understood with sudden clarity why he had been brought here, why he had been made to witness this moment. It was not simply to remember which branch survived. It was to understand that history was not made by great men making great decisions, but by ordinary people making impossible choices and living with the consequences. The morning wore on, and Thomas continued his observations, moving through the doubled city, witnessing both realities with equal attention. He saw the machinery of the terror grinding on in one branch, saw hope slowly returning in the other. He saw the same people existing in both branches, their lives different but parallel, their essential natures unchanged regardless of which version of April 13th they experienced. And everywhere he went, he encountered more ghosts like Jean-Baptiste, shades of those who had died in one branch or the other, observers caught between realities, bearing witness to what might have been. As noon approached and the church bells throughout Paris prepared to toll the hour, Thomas made his way to a vantage point overlooking the city. From there, he could see both versions of Paris spreading out below him, two great cities occupying the same space, each one real, each one demanding recognition. The divergence was reaching its peak. Soon, it would collapse, and one reality would become the true thread while the other faded into echo. And Thomas would have to choose which one he remembered more strongly, which one would receive the weight of his consciousness, which one would persist more powerfully in the deep structures of time. The choice that would define not just his understanding of history, but potentially the understanding of generations yet to come. The bells began to toll. Noon had arrived, and the final hour of the divergence had begun.